What's up, everybody? This is Chapter 6 of Karl Korsch, A Study in Western Marxism by Patrick Goode. Chapter 6 is titled The Materialist Conception of History, and it's in italics, so it's the book. The Materialist Conception of History is what this chapter is about. Yeah. So here we go. Let me read the end notes real quick, see if there's anything. Just because I'm kind of on this thing where I'm like, I want to read the end notes after it. I used to read it in the middle, but I'm like, dude, let's get this shit over with. It's very insufficient to flip back and forth all the time, you know? Okay. Chapter 6, let's see. Aufruf für Miasnikov appeared in Die Action, May 1929, signed Kommunistische Politik, but the last issue of the periodical appeared, as far as can be ascertained, in December 1927. It says, I think this is Kautsky. It says, quote, "This book is the quintessence of my life's work. It represents the method upon which I have based a half-century's work. It is not merely the foundation, but the result of the work of my life," end quote. See F. Jakubowski's Ideology and Superstructure in Historical Materialism. It says, which is, quote, says, quote, "Kautsky wrote the book, The Materialist Conception of History, at a time when he was no longer generally recognized as the standard Marxist theoretician. Nevertheless, it still typifies the ideas of the Second International, both in the pre-war period and today," end quote. F. Jakubowski. And this is a quote from Lenin from the 6th of July, 1920, in a preface to Imperialism. Quote, "The views held by Kautsky and his like are a complete renunciation of those same revolutionary principles of Marxism that writer has championed for decades," end quote. See Lenin, The Proletarian Revolution, and the Renegade Kautsky. See Lenin on the Significance of Militant Materialism. For Marx's rejection of 18th century materialism, see The Holy Family, Chapter 6, Section 3C, Critical Battle Against French Materialism. See Lukács' article, Bernstein's Triumph, Notes on the Essays Written in Honor of Karl Kautsky's 70th birthday. Quote, this is from Lukács' Political Writings, 1919 to 1929. See Krupskaya, Memories of Lenin. Krupskaya being Lenin's wife. See Lenin's article, What the Friends of the People Are and How They Fight the Social Democrats. See also Korsch, Lenin über den historischen Materialismus. See Lenin's Materialism and Imperial Criticism. See Engels' Dialectics of Nature. It says Engels' Dialectics of Nature, which would have also offered much support to Lenin's position, did not appear until 1925. There's a quote from Engels, Ludwig Feuerbach, in The End of Classical German Philosophy, quote, "The most telling refutation of this, as of all other philosophical crotchets, is practice, namely experiment and industry," end quote. Engels. See Bukharin, Theory of Historical Materialism. Lenin, One Step Forward, Two Steps Back. Section R, which is titled A Few Words on Dialectics. See Kautsky, Bernstein und das Sozialdemokratische Programm. There's a review of this in Lenin's collected works. Quote, I am fully aware of my unpreparedness for this in this sphere, bracket, i.e. of philosophy, in bracket, which prevents me from speaking about it in public, end quote. Letter to Gorky, 7th of February, 1908. I'm assuming that's Lenin. Quote, I think this is Lenin again. Let me add in parenthesis for the benefit of young party members that you cannot hope to become a real intelligent communist without making a study of all of Plekhanov's philosophical writings, because nothing better has been written on Marxism anywhere in the world, end quote. Lenin. And I think that's from, once again, On the Trade Unions. See also preface to the second edition of Materialism and Imperial Criticism from the 2nd of September 1920, recommending earlier work. See Pannekoek, Lenin as philosopher. The material base of Lenin's Marxism, quote, in Russia was the struggle against Tsarism, to a great extent comparable with earlier struggles against absolutism in Europe, end quote. Pannekoek. See Korsch, Marxist Ideology in Russia, published in Living Marxism, 1938. See Korsch, Marxism and the Present Task of the Proletarian Class Struggle, published in Living Marxism, 1938. Korsch, The Passing of Marxian Orthodoxies, published in International Council Correspondence, 1937. Also, quote, bracket, Lenin saw that, in bracket, the guarantee of the revolutionary character of the workers' movement was to be sought not in its real, and in particular in its economic class content, but expressed only in the subjective leadership of this struggle by the Revolutionary Party, directed by a correct Marxist theory, end quote. I'm not sure where this is from, that's Korsch. Says Alfred Schmidt in the book The Concept of Nature in Marx merely observes, quote, Karl Korsch, one of the few authors in the extensive literature on Marx who understood the complex dialectic of nature and history, emphatically criticized Kautsky's distortion of the Marxist theory of history, unquote. And see the article by L. Seppa titled Korsch's Marxism, published in TLS, Winter Spring 1975-76. Okay. So let's see if we can get to the actual article here. Oh, I'm there. Oh, bitch. Alright, there we are. Okay, so we got the endnotes out of the way. So hopefully some of that'll fill in some, make some sense of what we're about to read. It's probably annoying to hear right off the bat. Probably should have said that to the end, but I'm experimenting. In 1928, Korsch's mandate to the Reichstag expired. He did not stand again, and the Kommunistische Politik group dissolved itself. During this period, Korsch concentrated on literary activity. Up to the time of writing the book Karl Marx, 1936 onwards, the two most important works were Die Materialistische Geschichtsauffassung, The Materialist Conception of History, published in 1929, and the Anti-Critique to Marxism and Philosophy, published in 1930. The sure touch which he had shown in earlier writings had temporarily deserted him. In fact, in these years, Korsch was looking for a direction. For example, he later considered writing a long introduction to a German edition of the works of Antonio Labriola. I don't know who really know much about Antonio Labriola, but it seems like he's kind of a certain precursor of perhaps Western Marxism, like kind of critiquing some of the more dogmatic scientific elements of Second International Marxism. At least I get that feel. I know that Maximilien Rubel appraises him highly. In Korsch's opinion, Labriola was, quote, the best interpreter of the Marxist method, and in particular its methodological foundations, at the same time a fundamental Hegelian, end quote. Korsch. There were two other reasons for his interest in Labriola. First, Labriola stood at a turning point. After him came the syndicalist in France and the revisionist in Germany. Secondly, the significance of Labriola for the development of Marxism in the West is a striking parallel to the meaning of Plekhanov for the development of Marxism in the East. However, this remained an unrealized project, and the book, The Materialist Conception of History, was the only book he wrote. Korsch's book, Anti-Critique to Marxism and Philosophy, is only an extended essay. I shall now examine the two completed works of this period. The book, The Materialist Conception of History, is a much slighter work than the book, Marxism and Philosophy. The critical energy, which in earlier works Korsch had concentrated to the extent that the denseness of his ideas conceals the structure, e.g. in the book, Marxism and Philosophy, seemed to be dissipated. On a smaller scale, it is often a rambling and inconsequential. On a smaller scale, is often as rambling and inconsequential as the Kautsky volume, which it was criticizing. He complains that there is not a strong connection between the thoughts and chapters of Kautsky's work, but his own is hardly free of these faults. For example, it is overburdened with lengthy footnotes and quotations from Marx and Kautsky, in one case to the extent of a whole page of small type consisting of quotes and comments. Its style is often pedestrian and indulges a rather labored irony at Kautsky's expense. This applies particularly to the chapter on the state, which discusses at great length the point that, quote, not as for Marx, Engels, quote, bourgeois society, and quote, but the, quote, state forms for Kautsky, the true foundation of the whole development of man in the historical period is the creator of all things, end quote. Korsch. The work focuses too much on criticizing Kautsky to be able to make any more general points, and it remains very much a work of its time. 5 of the chapters of Korsch's book deal directly with Kautsky, while the 6th and the last, quote, the historical significance of Kautskyism, end quote, is a summary and an evaluation. Korsch does not follow the structure of Kautsky's book very closely, nor does his book have its own integrated structure since it deals with rather loosely related themes. Korsch claims that the, quote, keystone of Kautsky's argument is his analysis of the state, but as I have remarked above, he shows rather easily that Kautsky's conception of the state is different from Marx's. Kautsky had claimed that his book was the, quote, quintessence and the result of his whole life's work. It is interesting to note that, in his introduction, Kautsky reflected on the experiences of 1918 to 1919 and drew general conclusions from them, which are precisely the opposite of Korsch's guiding principle, that an active effort of the will is needed in order to achieve socialism. In Kautsky's opinion, the materialist conception of history, quote, does not deny the power of the human will, but shows that it only achieves a lasting and irreversible victory when it operates in the direction given by the economic conditions, and when it keeps within the limit of what is possible at the time, end quote. Kautsky. Perhaps the most valuable approach to such a diffuse work as Kautsky's would be to identify those elements which are important to the development of Korsch's thought at this period. We must therefore identify then set aside those arguments which had already been discussed in the book Marxism and Philosophy. The arguments which are repeated are as follows. Kautsky had split Marx's unified dialectical materialist conception of history into 2 parts. One of these is a, quote, general philosophy of historical materialism, end quote, concerned with the, quote, laws of the materialist conception of history as a whole, end quote. The other contains, quote, only those laws of previous history which are discovered following research into history from the standpoint of this conception of history, end quote. Korsch argued that to regard the materialist conception of history in this way as a superhistorical principle is to commit the serious mistake of separating form from content. Quote, As a method and a general intellectual direction, the materialist conception of history is from its content and this particular content to which the quote materialist conception of history and quote belongs as its corresponding form was shaped by the theory and praxis of the class action of the proletariat, end quote. Korsch. Korsch maintains that Kautsky's ideas belong to the Kantian tradition of distinguishing universally valid laws of form and particular laws of nature, content, but does not develop this point. In fact, precisely the same argument had already appeared in the book Marxism and Philosophy. The section titled Dialectics and Development might be expected to contain a more extensive discussion of this and other points related to abstract philosophical questions, but in it there is little that is new. The section begins by stating that the central concept of the materialist conception of history is that the conception of development, Entwicklung, has a threefold significance in Marx and Engels, quote, as thought, dialectic, as becoming, development in the narrower sense, in nature and society, and as deed, revolutionary class struggle, end quote. Korsch. At the end of this section, Korsch clearly states what he considers to be Kautsky's philosophical standpoint, namely the naturalistic materialism of the period of the Enlightenment and the revolutionary era of the bourgeoisie, the 17th and 18th centuries, precisely that contemplative, anschauende materialism which Marx had criticized in the Theses on Feuerbach. This is an important point, which will be considered when the new aspects of Korsch's ideas are dealt with. Here I shall merely note that although Korsch tests Kautsky's conception of development against the three aspects of the criterion which he had established, thought, becoming, and deed, Korsch does not attempt to justify the concept of development itself. The second argument put forward in the book, The Materialist Conception of History, which merely repeats ideas to be found in the earlier work, concerns the relation of theory to practice. For Kautsky, Marxism is, quote, purely scientific theory. For Kautsky, Marxism is a, quote, purely scientific theory, which, as such, is in no way linked with the proletariat, end quote. Kautsky, end quote, Korsch. This point was dealt with in my discussion of Kautsky's criticisms of Marxism and philosophy in Die Gesellschaft. The third argument does not so much explicitly repeat as bring out a feature of the earlier work, which was to become much more important later in the book Karl Marx. This is his emphasis upon the specificity of Marxism. Whereas Marx and Engels, quote, grasped the laws of development of society, supposed by bourgeois idealism to be a universal law of nature, as laws linked with definite historical conditions and appropriate only to these conditions, end quote. Kautsky, quote, transformed the historical laws of the development of society so far into eternally valid laws, henceforth unchangeable, end quote. I'm going to repeat that because that seems important. This is his emphasis on the specificity of Marxism. Whereas Marx and Engels, quote, grasped the laws of development of society, supposed by bourgeois idealism to be a universal law of nature, as laws linked with definite historical conditions and appropriate only to these conditions, end quote. Kautsky, quote, transforms the historical laws of the development of society so far into eternally valid laws, henceforth unchangeable, end quote. Korsch. And that's kind of like, that's something it was already mentioned. Alfred Schmidt was already mentioned, but this is kind of like something that's kind of like a very important to like critical theory informed, Frankfurt School critical theory informed conceptions of Marxism and others, not just the Frankfurt School but others, emphasizing the specificity of the historical laws analyzed by Marx, for instance, in his most scientific work, his most rigorous work, Capital. These are laws specific to capitalism, and that socialism doesn't entail the managing of these laws or like mastery of these laws or acceptance of these laws as like trans-historical facts of life, but as a second nature to be overcome, right? In this sense, they accuse, the accusation would be that traditional Marxism, which kind of has this kind of exception of these laws, kind of accepts these laws as trans-historical conditions, as Korsch says about Kautsky, whether rightly or wrongly, this constitutes a form of fetishism in which specific social relations, specific social forms of life are rendered trans-historical, right? So, and that's kind of like one of the big things of a lot of like the value form or like form analytical approaches is analyzing the specificity, the historical specificity of capitalism, and for instance, and it's like guiding feature like the law of value, right? So, socialism is about humanity breaking these laws that bind it as like a new compulsion. That's something very Western Marxisty. It is this notion of the specificity of Marxism which underlies the schema of the different periods of Marxism, and its new periodization of Marxism, which is the original feature of Die materialistische Geschichtsauffassung. Geschichtsauffassung. Having dealt with these recurring points, which do, however, occupy a large part of the book, let us analyze the new arguments it contains. Its main aim is to reevaluate the quote, historical significance of Kautskyism and quote, in such a way as also to eliminate the relation between it and quote, Leninism. Korsch was concerned to give quite a different answer about the nature of Kautskyism from that provided by the orthodox quote, Marxist-Leninists, end quote. It would be generally agreed that Kautskyism is not an ideology fixed for all time, but a historically variable entity. The position he wishes to dispute is that of, quote, communist orthodoxy, end quote. Quote, if one determines the various phases of this historical development, first of all in the usual ideological manner, according to its contemporary relation to the original, quote, theory of Marx and Engels, one can characterize Kautsky's present work and that of recent years as a complete transition from a concealed to an open revisionism, end quote. Korsch. Let us consider the 2 points he makes about this method of assessing Kautskyism, and the result it usually leads to. At the beginning of the book, Korsch insists that the real significance of Kautsky's work is not its ideological content, but it is, quote, a historical phenomenon which stands in a definite relationship, to the class struggle of the proletariat, end quote. Korsch. Thus, Korsch's methodological premise is that, quote, the following critical investigations relate, to the significance of Korsch's theory and the ideological expression of a definite historical movement, end quote. Korsch. However, this procedure and the accompanying caution is not always observed by Korsch himself. Korsch makes copious quotations from Marx, counterposing these passages to similarly lengthy excerpts from Kautsky in order to show the discrepancies between them. But when this method was followed by the, quote, orthodox Marxists of the Communist Party, it led to results Korsch could not accept. For them, Kautsky's materialist conception of history is quite simply the, quote, ideology of the Second International, end quote, which, as the representative of, quote, international reformism, end quote, forms a contrast to the Third International as the chosen representative of, quote, international revolutionary Marxism, end quote. It is alleged by, quote, Leninists that Kautsky's misfortune is that he is continually stumbling over the remnants of Marxist thought. The, quote, revisionist Kautsky of today is to be compared to the Kautsky of the, quote, earlier revolutionary Marxist period. This argument implies that the Communist Party theoretician of today, there may remain much of value in Kautsky's work. By contrast, Korsch argues that for an apparently more, quote, ideological view than the simple one that Kautsky simply turned renegade, a view held, for example, in Lenin's piece, The Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky. On the other hand, of course, Kautsky's evolution is not merely ideological. Quote, it is not a change in Kautsky's theoretical attitude towards Marxism, but only a consequence of external historical facts, that all revolutionary questions were posed more clearly and unavoidably by the highest class struggles of the period, of the war and afterwards, within Marxist theory too. So that with increasing frequency, Kautsky, now has to go over from a concealed, quote, orthodox revisionism to an open, naked surrender of revolutionary Marxism, end quote, Korsch. This is not to deny that Kautsky did play a certain progressive role. For a certain period, his ideology was the only way of making Marxism useful to the masses. Korsch justifies this claim by means of a curious simile. The ideological service performed by Kautskyanism is just that of the Scholius, parenthesis, gloss Autoren, in parenthesis, and post-Scholius of the Middle Ages, under the appearance of a merely orthodox interpretation of the Justinian Pendects. They were able to satisfy for a time the juridical requirements of the newly rising bourgeois class. Likewise, Kautsky was temporarily able to assist the working class struggle while it had not yet developed its own theory. However, the regressive side of Kautskism will halt the development of the working class towards socialism. The decisive feature of Korsch's interpretation is his location of Kautsky in a certain philosophical context. Kautsky's attacks on other non-Marxist philosophers are misplaced because, quote, the dominant basic tendency in both bourgeois philosophy, natural and social science of today, does not start from a metaphysical, dualistic, or idealistic basis, orientation, but from precisely that, quote, materialistic, natural, scientific, end quote, outlook for which Kautsky too enters the list, end quote. Korsch. This is rather a difficult argument to deal with. What criterion could be employed to settle the question of whether idealism or mechanical materialism is the dominant intellectual tendency in a particular period? It is difficult to know how to evaluate such general and speculative statements. Empirical tests of any kind, however broadly conceived, would seem to be out of place. Perhaps, what is more important is to establish the logical validity of these approaches. It is rather surprising that with his philosophical bent, Korsch did not do this, for ultimately it would have been more rewarding, rather than making speculations, for this is all such statements can be, about which of these ideologies is dominant. What was of value in the philosophical work of Kautsky and Lenin? They had performed a valuable service in refuting obscurantism, religious mysticism, and idealism by applying the materialist method. Lenin himself had argued that the periodical Unter dem Banner des Marxismus should contain refutations of religious thought, if necessary relying on 18th century atheists and Enlightenment thinkers. Engels had said that if the French workers, unlike the Germans, were not already atheists, quote, nothing could be simpler than to ensure that the magnificent French materialist literature of the last century is widely distributed among the workers. That literature in which the French mind has made its greatest achievements, in form and content, which, taking into consideration the state of science at that time, in its content today continues to be highly rated. Its form has never been attained again, end quote. Engels. But Korsch's main objection is that Kautsky's, quote, materialist critique is not carried through consistently. Paradoxically, this means that Kautsky is led to take up an idealist Kantian position on philosophy. The argument for this position is rather complicated. On the one hand, Kautsky supports the 18th century materialists in their attack on mysticism and religion. Yet when it comes to the task he sets himself, that of bringing Marxism into line with the latest developments in science, Kautsky feels the need to supplement a materialist approach to the question with an idealist philosophy. The philosophy he chooses for this task is not that of Hegel, but Kant. Kautsky explains that the Kantian criticism, quote, really could become the starting point for a higher form of materialism, end quote, end quote. Kautsky. It is not easy to interpret Kautsky's position here. In his earlier period, Kautsky had been one of the staunchest opponents of the neo-Kantianism, which gained wide acceptance in Marxist circles, especially among the, quote, Austro-Marxists, Max Adler and Otto Bauer in particular. Kautsky's book, Ethik und materialistische Geschichtsauffassung, had criticized their position very sharply. Korsch claimed that this tendency to neo-Kantianism was already present in a concealed form even in Kautsky's earlier critique of Kant, but his argument in support of this point is neither extended nor convincing. It seems unfortunate he does not explore this dualism between neo-Kantianism and mechanical naturalistic materialism any further, because he would have been able to apply this criticism to some of the leading communist thinkers such as Bukharin, which would have given his argument a more general application. Instead, Korsch argues at some length that Kautsky's actual knowledge of the natural sciences since Marx's time is insufficient for the task he had set himself. Quote, but even simply from the standpoint of modern bourgeois science, his, Kautsky's, completely negative relationship to all its results and to the spirit of modern scientific investigation, reveals itself, end quote. He also points out that mathematics are, with the exception of some, quote, excessively naive remarks, end quote, missing from Kautsky's book. But surely the extent of Kautsky's scientific knowledge is a secondary problem. The important philosophical question is the validity of Kautsky's program of, quote, revising Marxism in the light of modern developments in natural science. Perhaps this is an early indication of Korsch's dissatisfaction with philosophy. From this period onwards, he showed an increasing interest in mathematics and natural sciences. What is new in the book, The Materialist Conception of History, is the clear implication that, quote, Leninism is not an adequate form of Marxism for the development of the revolutionary class struggle. If the final verdict on Kautskianism is that it is, quote, the specific phenomenal form of this dialectical transformation of, quote, Marxist theory, accepted by the modern workers' movement as an ideology from a form of development into a fetter on the revolutionary proletarian class struggle, end quote. And if Kautskianism was ambiguous from the start, this ambiguity being shared by, quote, Leninism too, then clearly, quote, Leninism must also be suspect. Korsch makes this point clear in a footnote when speaking of the, quote, fundamental theoretical affinity between the Leninist and the Kautskian varieties of the so-called, quote, Marxist center, end quote, Korsch. Although Korsch may have shown that Lenin and Kautsky shared similar general ideological positions, formally considered, during the period of the Second International, what is the relevance of this to the Marxist movement 10 years after the foundation of the Third International? Whatever their previous similarities from the outbreak of the First World War, Lenin began a decisive struggle against Kautsky. Kautsky's ideas were of crucial danger to the Marxist movement at a specific period only. As Lukács pointed out, quote, it is this diversionary strategy, this deliberate attempt to prevent a clear and correct split, between revolutionaries and reformists in the Workers' Party, or, when a split has already become inevitable, the engineering of a false split. It is this which constitutes the historic omission of Karl Kautsky as the theoretical leader of the centrists in the Second International. Lukács. Thus, although Korsch clearly showed that Kautsky had gone over from concealed to open revisionism, he failed to realize that at the same time, Kautsky lost any significance for the revolutionary movement. As a concealed revisionist, Kautsky posed a danger to sections of the working class, which did not realize that, despite Kautsky's Marxist phraseology, in fundamental terms, he did not differ from the open anti-Marxist reformists. In the period 1914 to 1919, Lenin recognized this danger for the revolutionary movement and consistently polemicized against this view on the grounds that, quote, the danger of Kautskyism lies in the fact that, it endeavors to reconcile the proletariat with the, quote, bourgeois labor party, end quote, to preserve the unity of the proletariat with the party and thereby enhances the latter's prestige. The masses no longer follow the avowed social chauvinists, The Kautskyites' mass defense of the social chauvinists is much more dangerous, end quote. Lenin. It is because Korsch's book was directed against a thinker who no longer had any contemporary relevance for the Marxist movement that it is so unsatisfactory. Despite the correctness of many of the arguments, the book, The Materialist Conception of History, is a disappointment by comparison with the book Marxism and Philosophy. As we have shown above, Kautsky's work was of little political significance, nor did it require any great theoretical insight on Korsch's part to demolish, as he did, the book's theoretical pretensions. Finally, it represents a transition stage in which Korsch's repudiation of, quote, Leninism is not yet completed. To find a more extensive statement of his new ideas on, quote, Leninism, it would be more profitable to turn to Korsch's book Anti-Critique, although it will be necessary to continue to refer to the book The Materialist Conception of History on some points. A substantial part of the book, the Anti-Critique, merely repeats arguments put forward in the book Marxism and Philosophy, and consists in refuting misconceptions of his earlier position. As such, the most relevant of these counter-objections have been examined, so that in this chapter only the new positions on, quote, Leninism will be considered. Almost from the start, he states much more forcibly than he had in the book The Materialist Conception of History what is to be the new position, that Lenin in fact never renounced the Second International's version of Marxism, so that, quote, the real divisions on all major and decisive questions is between the old Marxist orthodoxy of Kautsky allied to the new Russian or, quote, Leninist orthodoxy on the one side, and all critical and progressive theoretical tendencies in the proletarian movement today on the other side. And Korsch. This is very interesting too, because I kind of have the impression that this is something that's by like Lenin scholars, for instance, Lars Lee. He has the opinion of like Lenin being like a thorough Kautskian, and that in his like outlook, and basically that I'm not an expert on it. I don't know how that precisely relates to what Korsch is saying here, but definitely it was like, like Lenin really did think that Kautsky was in fact a renegade, and that he was in some sense upholding like Kautsky's tradition, or Kautsky's legacy, his legacy post renegacy. I mean pre-renegacy. So it seems like something that other scholars have said, or something similar has been said, I guess. Maybe not precisely the same thing, but something similar. Korsch now states more explicit than he had done in the book Marxism and Philosophy the purpose of that work. Quote, the general problem of the Marxist conception of ideology, or the relationship between consciousness and being, in Korsch. Korsch claims that there was complete solidarity on theoretical questions between the new communist Marxist orthodoxy and that of the old social democrats. Behind communist complaints that Korsch had presented too schematized a picture of the Second International, quote, there is a dogmatic attempt to defend the, quote, Marxism of the Second International, whose spiritual legacy Lenin and his companions never abandoned, in spite of some of the things they said in the heat of battle, end quote. Korsch. In the book, The Materialist Conception of History, Korsch distinguishes between ideology and theory in the following manner. The bourgeois conception of science is ideological, in that it opposes theoretical and scientific knowledge as an independent entity to historical practice, whereas the new scientific principle of the dialectical materialism of Marx and Engels is that all scientific theory is only the product of the historical movement itself. As Marx had said, the theoretical presuppositions of the communists, quote, merely express in general terms actual relations springing from an existing class struggle, end quote. Marx. Lenin and Kautsky failed to make this distinction, so that in their hands Marxism became an ideology. In a famous passage discussing how the proletariat acquires a socialist consciousness, Kautsky had written, quote, socialist consciousness is therefore something that is brought into proletarian struggle from the outside and not something that grew naturally from within it, end quote. Kautsky. In the book What is to be Done, Lenin had quoted this passage in full and added the equally famous comment, quote, the history of all countries shows that the working class exclusively by its own effort is able to develop only trade union consciousness, end quote. Lenin. What was the philosophical character of, quote, Leninism? In the first place, quote, Lenin is not primarily concerned with the theoretical problem of whether the materialist philosophy he propounds is true or untrue. He is concerned with the practical question of its use for the revolutionary struggle of the proletariat. Lenin is concerned with the practical question of its use for the revolutionary struggle of the proletariat. End quote. Korsch. Lenin was particularly concerned about that philosophical questions should not become objects of factional strife, and thus hinder the work of the party. Quote, Marxism should be a private matter. The tactical differences between Bolsheviks and Mensheviks would be unnecessarily sharpened if the independent question of Marxism's epistemological compatibility with Spinoza and Holbach, or with Mach and Avenarius, were brought into the argument. Thus it seemed that Lenin was very unsympathetic to the whole problem of Marxism and philosophy, the necessity for Marxists to have a positive position on philosophy. As Korsch points out, this is the same as the Lassallean standpoint of considering that the practical political party can transcend philosophy through practice without comprehending it theoretically. The book Marxism and Philosophy had effectively refuted this position. But there is a paradox here. Why then had Lenin, the practical politician, placed such great importance on writing the book Materialism and Imperial Criticism? It occupied nearly a year of his time, required a special trip to London, and was regarded by him as an important task. It's also the philosophical notebooks, the engagement with Lenin in the middle of the war, right? With Hegel in the middle of the war. It occupied nearly a year of Lenin's time, required a special trip to London, and was regarded by Lenin as an important task. As a quote orthodox Marxist, Korsch had suggested that this paradox could be explained by referring to Lenin's skill as a tactician. In explaining Lenin's phrase about the quote historical service performed by the Second International, he uses the same argument, but in neither case does it really explain anything. Let us continue with Korsch's analysis of Lenin's philosophy. Just as Korsch did in his Die materialistische Geschichte auf Assam, Lenin thought that the dominant tendencies in bourgeois philosophy were idealism and mysticism, so that it was necessary, quote, to stress materialism against certain fashionable tendencies in bourgeois philosophy, rather than to stress dialectics against the vulgar, pre-dialectical, and in some cases explicitly undialectical and anti-dialectical materialism of bourgeois science, end quote. Korsch. In short, in the term, quote, dialectical materialism, Lenin put the accent on materialism. While repeating his contention that the main trend in bourgeois philosophy, natural and social science, is not idealism but contemplative materialism, Korsch supports Lenin's defense of bourgeois materialism against the recurrence of, quote, spiritualist tendencies. The problem is that Lenin gets no further than this. Quote, Lenin goes back to the absolute polarities of, quote, thought and, quote, being, quote, spirit and, quote, matter, which had formed the basis of the philosophical and even some of the religious disputes that had divided the two currents of the Enlightenment in the 17th and 18th centuries, end quote. Korsch. Before assessing this criticism of Lenin, let us follow Korsch's argument about Lenin's philosophy to its conclusion. Apparently, the Hegelian period of Lenin's philosophical writings, 1914 to 16, which had directly inspired Korsch's own book, Marxism and Philosophy, would surely refute the idea that Lenin was always a mechanical materialist. Even after the publication of Lenin's philosophical notebooks, in which Lenin's later debt to Hegel is quite clear, Korsch clung to the view that, quote, a belated revival of the whole of the formerly disowned idealistic dialectics of Hegel served to reconcile the acceptance by the Leninists of old bourgeois materialism and the formal demands of an apparently anti-bourgeois and proletarian revolutionary tendency, end quote. Korsch. What was Lenin's conception of the transition from the idealist dialectic of Hegel to the dialectical materialism of Marx and Engels? It was simply conceived of as a materialist, quote, transposition, Umstülpung, at best consisting simply of a terminological change, in which the absolute is in the Marxist system to be named, quote, material, and not, quote, spiritual. This concludes the strictly philosophical argument. How adequate is his evaluation of Lenin as a philosopher? There can be no doubt that until he read Hegel, Lenin's ideas did contain elements of vulgar materialism. As Korsch was to point out later, Lenin had declared in an early article of 1894, quote, "What Marx and Engels called the dialectical method, is nothing else than the scientific method in sociology," end quote. Lenin. The positions taken in the book Materialism and Empiricism are often as philosophically sophisticated as Dr. Johnson's refutation of Berkeley's solipsism. For example, Lenin glories in being a, quote, naive realist, end quote. The, quote, naive realism of any healthy person who has not been an inmate of a lunatic asylum or a pupil of the idealist philosophers consists in the view that things, exist independently of our sensations. Materialism deliberately makes the, quote, naive belief of mankind the foundation of its theory of knowledge, end quote. Lenin. For two of his main arguments, Lenin relied on the authority of Engels, in particular the later works such as Ludwig Feuerbach and Anti-Düring. The first argument concerns the relation between ideas and reality. Engels, quote, constantly speaks in his works of things and their mental pictures or images, and it is obvious that these mental images arise exclusively from sensations, end quote. Lenin. The second concerns the refutation of the Kantian, quote, thing in itself, which in Ludwig Feuerbach, Engels said would be the result of, quote, praxis, namely experiment and industry, end quote. Thus, two of Korsch's objections so far advanced would also apply to Engels, but he did not pursue this line of argument. Further, there is a real philosophical problem here. Korsch was unwilling to accept the separation of theory from practice implied in the passive theoretical commentaries of Kautsky, but on the other hand, although he would reject the vulgar pragmatism which Lenin sometimes appears to accept, and which his disciples such as Bukharin frankly acknowledge, in such statements as, quote, when we eat, conduct the class struggle, none of us ever thinks of doubting the existence of the external world, end quote. Bukharin. Is Korsch's position more than a refined version of this? His tendencies to voluntarism and stress on, quote, practice, which are a constant feature of his work, do they not approach the position of Engels and even Bukharin? In any case, the assessment of Lenin's position is not as simple as Korsch claims. Although it is undeniably true that there are elements of vulgar materialism in Lenin's views, it would be mistaken to call his philosophy, quote, vulgar materialism, and, quote, tout court. For example, even in Materialism and Empiricism, Lenin made formal statements about, quote, dialectics, which Korsch could hardly have disagreed with. In one passage dealing with Engels' critique of French 18th century materialism, i.e. the very position Korsch ascribes to Lenin, two of its limitations are said to be the anti-dialectical character of that philosophical school and its tendencies to mechanical materialism. Elsewhere, Lenin explicitly states that, quote, Marx and Engels laid the emphasis in their works rather on dialectical materialism than on dialectical materialism. So emphasis on dialectical as opposed to materialism. They insisted rather on historical materialism than on historical materialism. So emphasis on historical and dialectical rather than materialism. End quote. Lenin. Korsch could hardly have disagreed with Lenin's emphasis. Outside the strictly philosophical work, Lenin also made impeccable statements about, quote, dialectics in his polemical works. For example, at the end of the book or pamphlet, One Step Forward, Two Steps Back. If Lenin did on some occasions hold a, quote, vulgar, materialist, end quote, position, on others Lenin was perfectly capable of arguing for, quote, dialectics. Korsch's claim that there was a coincidence of views between Lenin and the Marxists of the Second International is much more justifiable. See, I know what I'm talking about. As has already been shown, Korsch was quite right to point out that Lenin drew on Kautsky for his criticism of Bernstein. He might also have pointed out that in Kautsky's Bernstein und das Sozialdemokratische Programm eine Antikritik, Kautsky criticized Bernstein's, quote, mechanical materialism and included quite a lengthy section on dialectics. Lenin seemingly agreed with this and simply gave a brief precis of it. So the positions of Lenin and the Second International coincide, as it were, in their ambiguity. Korsch also quite correctly remarked that their views on socialist consciousness coincided, as revealed by Lenin's lengthy quotation of Kautsky and What is to be Done. He could have strengthened his case by pointing out that Lenin also agreed with Kautsky over the agrarian question, which is important for Russian Marxists, and that Hilferding's finance capital had been of great service in the writing of Lenin's classic, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. Seen in this formal sense, Trotsky had even less reputable connections with the social democrat and later war profiteer Parvis. And I think the connection with Parvis was larger than that. I can't remember, but I have a piece on here about Parvis, and I think there's either speculation that he was kind of the reason that Lenin was able to get a sealed train to the Finland station from Geneva, right? Like I saw in West End Girls, remember, from Lake Geneva to the Finland station, you know? Downtown of West End, yeah. Anyway, enough of that. A crucial feature of Korsch's estimate of Parvis's and also, like, to my understanding, Trotsky's main connections with Social Democrat with Parvis is that Parvis was one of the people, I think, that was an inspiration theoretically for Trotsky's theory of Trotsky's ideas about permanent revolution and combined and uneven development and the relationship between Russia and the world capitalist system, which, regardless of anything else, is precisely what Lenin adopted in 1917. I think that's a main Trotsky, a big argument of a lot of Trotskyists, is that Lenin accepted the theory of permanent revolution in 1917 when he had not before, right? There's like the famous quote or whatever about Lenin in a party school in Switzerland during the war, that, maybe 20 years from now there will be a bourgeois democratic revolution in Russia, right? It clearly seemed like the idea of an imminent imminent dictatorship of the proletariat in Russia seemed like, for at least, maybe I'm wrong about this. This is me talking on my ass. I'm not a Lenin expert, but seemed like a very imminent, the idea that there was some kind of imminent dictatorship of the proletariat that was going to come to be on Lenin's part. Seems like it wasn't. Seems like something he kind of almost came to later or something like that. Maybe I'm wrong about that. I'm talking my ass a bit. But there's definitely a big overlap between Trotsky's pre-existing theories on permanent revolution, which he got from Parvis and Lenin. Yeah, I don't know why the inclusion of Parvis's bizarre activities is a fucking socialist entrepreneur or something like that, and war profiteer. There's much to do with these philosophical problems. It kind of just seems like a needless moral injunction or appeal that is interesting but isn't relevant to the question at hand. A crucial feature of Korsch's estimate of Lenin's philosophy is fair to understand it as a process of development. There is no doubt that Lenin's philosophical notebooks are much more philosophically sophisticated than anything Lenin had previously written. Earlier references in Lenin's work to, quote, dialectics, while they refute Korsch's rather simplistic view of Lenin as a, quote, mechanical materialist, unquote, do show rather a formal understanding of philosophical questions. Lenin himself admitted at the time of writing the book Materialism and Empirical Criticism that he was such a beginner in philosophical questions as to feel some hesitation in pronouncing on philosophy. What perhaps complicates the issue of Lenin's, quote, Hegelianism as much as anything else is Lenin's own failure to see the differences between the two philosophical periods of his life. Thus he still referred approvingly to Plekhanov and to his own earlier book Materialism and Empirical Criticism even after writing the philosophical notebooks. Clearly, Korsch's interpretation of Lenin's philosophy, while correct on some points, does not take into account all the complexities of Lenin's position, nor see it as a whole. How are we to interpret the significance of the book The Anti-Critique in Korsch's own work? After all, up until the mid-1920s he had been a fervent Leninist, and now, at the end of the decade, he adopts the opposite position. It is very difficult to make judgments on such a transitional period in Korsch's work, but I think that Rusconi's judgment may be accepted. Quote, standing on the letter of the writings of 1923 to 24, Korsch considers that Lenin rediscovered the true Marxist praxis, while in the Anti-Critique of 1930, Korsch has a diametrically opposed opinion. Besides, a change of judgment and a partial self-criticism is a matter of correcting an initial ambiguity, end quote. Rusconi. Although during his phase of party worship and, quote, orthodox Leninism, there are no reservations in his writings about this new position, we found that in the book Labor Law for Factory Councils, Korsch's grasp of the basic ideas of, quote, Lenin imperialism was rather shaky, and that in the book Marxism and Philosophy, the political conclusions drawn were vague and indefinite. Throughout this period, the relationship between the organized activity of the party and the spontaneity of the working class had remained unclarified. Now Korsch arrived at a much more definite position. He thought that the latter, which he saw as an essential component in the transition to socialism, was incompatible with the former. What his new position is will become clear when we move on from his new view of Lenin's philosophy to his reevaluation of Marxism itself. This has two aspects: a new periodization of Marxism and a reestimation of Russian Marxism. The new evaluation of Leninism leads to a rejection of the political theories of Marxism. Korsch now considered that the Marxism represented by Marxism-Leninism was no longer a progressive tendency in the labor movement. In all its historical phases of development, Russian Marxism still had, quote, ideological character, and stood in contradiction to the real movement of history. This view is true both for the first period of Marxism in Russia, when it served to reconcile the Russian intelligentsia with the development of capitalism, and for the second phase, which reached its high point with the Russian Revolution of 1905. In this period, all revolutionary Russian Marxists declared themselves in complete solidarity with the Second International. The same ideological character is shown in the third and last phase, in which, quote, it found its most vivid expression in Lenin's orthodox Marxist theory and his totally unorthodox practice. It is now caricatured by the glaring contradictions between theory and practice in contemporary, present-day, quote, Soviet Marxism, end quote, unquote, Korsch. Korsch does not go into more detail about the first phase, since it is not central to his argument. He had already written at some length about the second phase, more important for his argument, in the book The Anti-Critique. It was left to a later article titled The Marxist Ideology in Russia of 1938 to explain in more detail what Korsch meant by the third phase. In Western Europe, Marxism had developed as a theory after the bourgeois revolution had taken place, and it expressed a tendency to go beyond the goal of that revolutionary movement to champion those of the new proletarian movement. In Russia, Marxism was from the beginning merely an ideological form assumed by the material struggle for carrying through the capitalist development of industry in a pre-capitalist country. It remained the ideology of industrialization. Korsch continued to maintain, therefore, that the USSR was a new form of capitalism, a new way of carrying on the industrialization of a backward country. Although in the book die Tarifahigkeit, he had remarked on the similarities of Mussolini's Italy and the USSR in their repression of the trade union movement. He never went so far as to claim that the Soviet Union was itself fascist. To distinguish between the two regimes, he used a traditional Marxist criterion, that of the development of the productive forces. The difference between the Soviet Union and the fascist regimes was, quote, the fascist transformation of a country does not mean an economic revolution, nor a radical explosion of old relations of production and the liberation of new forces of production. This is, the main difference between fascism and Bolshevism, end quote. Korsch. And I think that seems kind of, to me at least, that seems pretty similar to what Trotsky would say. The main difference between Stalinism and fascism is that Stalinism constituted, in Trotsky's view, the Bonapartism of even like a totalitarian Bonapartism, really, um, um, in a situation in which the means of production have been nationalized, therefore their growth was facilitated. Whereas fascism was a form of, or comparable to Bonapartism, but instead of, but what main thing that distinguished them is that fascism held on to the old world in some way, whatever its thoughts about itself. It was holding on to it was trying to save a capitalism that wasn't savable, which had grown decadent and rotten. That was in its death agony. So fascism was trying to rescue. Was kind of blocking the progress of history and blocking the development of the productive forces by preventing bloodily socialist advance. Um, in fact, Trotsky says at some point, I think not at some point, but he says it in the death agony of capitalism, the 1938 sort of manifesto. I can't think of the word for it. Proclamation. I don't know. Whatever the 1938 proclamation of the Fourth International is that Stalinism politically is worse than fascism, and the only difference is that Stalinism is more barbaric in its violence. Now, granted, this is before World War II, right? So it's before the Holocaust proper, and it's before Barbarossa, right? So it's the and at that time, the expansionism of the Nazis was kind of a project undertaken. Not all of it, obviously, but a part of it, at least once the Nazi-Soviet Pact had come into being, it was done in alliance with the Soviet Union. So, Korsch, like Trotsky, isn't saying that fascism and Stalinism are the same, or in this case, Bolshevism. But he does think that they're quite close. Obviously, Trotsky would use the word Stalinism and not Bolshevism, of course. But yeah, it's just something to consider. And this traditional Marxist criterion is something that was shared by a lot of people in the anti-Stalinist camp. Thus, it can be seen after 1926, his basic evaluation of the Soviet Union remained the same: the state capitalism. What changed was the date from which he evaluated this evaluation was supposed to apply. Initially, he thought the state capitalism began with the new economic policy of 1921. Then he dated its origin from almost immediately after the revolution. It was said that there was nothing novel in this position. It must be said that there was nothing novel in this position, since it had been held by anarchists and even social democratic critics of the Russian Revolution almost immediately after the seizure of power. His new evaluation of the Soviet regime is not very original in itself. It is more significant for understanding Korsch's ideas in this period in that it puts forward a new position on the role of Marxism itself, a position which Korsch had not perhaps worked out fully in his writings on the Soviet Union, but which was made evident elsewhere. Thus Korsch was coming to question the right of Marxism to dominate the revolutionary movement. In 1928, for example, Korsch argued that, quote, for us, the increasingly more vacuous competitive struggles between the present SPD and the present KPD already belong historically to a past period of the workers' movement, end quote. Korsch, which could be seen as an implied rejection of Marxism itself. I don't see the reasoning of that last statement. This was soon to be made explicit at the level of abstract theory then concretized in his writings on the Spanish communes in the 1930s. The first general exposition of his new conception of Marxism is to be found in the essay Das Problem Staatseinheit, Föderalismus in der Französischen Revolution, unquote, of 1930. The nub of his criticism was that, when formulating the theory of the quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, Marx and Lenin had accepted the political forms of the quote, bourgeois revolution. When they declared the necessity of a new kind of state, quote, the essential difference of this new state of the proletarian dictatorship from the bourgeois dictatorship of the Jacobins, according to the Marxist and Leninist conception, lay only in its aims, in short, only in its economic and social essence, not at all in any difference in its political form. Unquote. Korsch. During the transformation of capitalism into socialism, the political form of the state is to be modeled after the Jacobin dictatorship. This means that federalism is to be unconditionally rejected, and the unified centralized form of the state preferred. Even the lesson which Marx and Engels drew from the Paris Commune, that the working class could not simply take possession of the old state machine and use it for its own purposes, but must be prepared to smash it, did not alter the fact that the Marxist state would also be centralized. Although in constitutional terms it was a federation of councils, the quote, Marxist-Leninist state in Russia, the first example of the quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, was in fact strongly unified and centralized in character. And this is the dictatorship of the proletariat put in quotes here. It's like whether it was actually a dictatorship of the proletariat, right? That's a question. A lot of people would say no, for pretty glaringly obvious reasons. The rest of the article contains further reflections on federalism and a sympathetic account of Proudhon's position. This historical account was continued in a later article in which he claimed that not only Lenin but also Marx and Engels had falsified the experience of the Paris Commune. Marxism had had very little impact on the Commune, which took its inspiration from Proudhon, Bakunin, and Blanqui. In fact, the Commune had essentially a federalist and not a centralized character. That seems basically true, right? That Marxism did not have a major influence on the Commune. That's my understanding. Anyone pleading referencing themselves to Marx and the Commune, to my understanding at least, would have been very rare. Korsch is now convinced that Marxism had a limited role to play in the class struggle, not because of any subsequent deformation of Marxism by Lenin or any of his successors, but because of the nature of Marxism itself. He expressed this view more clearly in an article written a few years later, which makes more explicit what is said above. Quote, Marx from the first to the last defined his concept of class in ultimately political terms, and in fact, though not in words, subordinated the multiple activities exerted by the masses in their daily class struggle to the activities exerted on their behalf by their political leaders. End quote. Korsch. In this way, Marxism was itself transformed into an ideology. For example, in his struggle against social democratic revisionism, Lenin, like Luxemburg, quote, made use of a wholly ideological platform, and that he sought the guarantee for the, quote, revolutionary character of the labor movement not in its actual economic and social class content, but expressly only in the leadership of this struggle by way of the revolutionary party, guided by a correct Marxist theory. But expressly only in the leadership of this struggle by way of the revolutionary party, guided by a correct Marxist theory, end quote. Korsch. Thus, using the distinction between ideology and theory mentioned earlier, Marxism itself can be shown to be an ideology. Elsewhere, Korsch even spoke of its being a myth of the Sorelian kind, to be judged by its usefulness in inspiring revolutionary movements. He disagreed with Sorel, however, in thinking that it was not the fate of all revolutionary theories to become merely inspirational myths. In summary, Korsch's view was that Marxism was only adequate to that stage of the class struggle at which the working class was fighting for, quote, bourgeois demands. It was insufficient, even a hindrance, when it was necessary to advance the independent interests of the proletariat, and when it imposed upon the proletariat given political forms of party-state dictatorship, relevant to the bourgeois revolution, whereas, quote, the real aim of the proletarian class struggle is not any kind of state, however, quote, democratic, quote, communal, or even, quote, councils based, but the classless and stateless communist society, end quote. Korsch. It is perhaps unfortunate that although during the period of his early writings about, quote, councils, he was writing about a contemporary experience in this period, there was no such movement in Germany, where the working class remained quite apathetic in the face of the growing Nazi threat, and was afterwards crushed. He was not able to test his ideas in the same way, after the only concrete situation in which, quote, councils actually existed at this time was in Spain. The articles Korsch wrote on the Spanish communes and the socialization of industry in Catalonia do little more than describe the situation, and graft onto this description the more abstract analysis which has already been presented. But in doing so, Korsch returns to an earlier theme and, as it were, closes the circle. In referring to the collectivization decree of the Catalonian Economic Council of the 24th of October 1936, Korsch points out that this legislation was only the acknowledgement after the fact of an already completed change in the organization of the transport and industrial system. Korsch compares this attitude of the communes to the lengthy deliberations of the Socialization Commission in Germany in 1918 to 1919. Korsch believed that the organization of the Spanish communes represented the form of struggle most suited to the goals of the working class. The communes preserved the spontaneous self-directing struggle for liberation, which is at the heart of the struggle for the, quote, councils in the immediate post-war period, and avoided the dangers of, quote, state politics. For the, quote, councils could all too easily become merely the political instrument of a new kind of state. Korsch thus continues to emphasize the virtues of a spontaneous movement from below. To sum up on the main works examined in this chapter, the book, The Materialist Conception of History, and the book, The Anti-Critique, it is not clear why Korsch took such pains over Kautsky's book. Perhaps it was because he considered him to be the most typical representative of, quote, Second International Marxism. But since he claims that there is not so much difference between the, quote, orthodox pre-war Trotsky and the post-war, quote, renegade, why did he not examine work from Kautsky's orthodox period? As George Lichtheim has pointed out, quote, Kautsky's standing as a theoretician must not be judged by his production, bracket, Die materialistische Geschichte Ausessung, bracket, of his declining years, end quote. George Lichtheim. Although Korsch's criticism is entirely correct from a, quote, activist standpoint, requiring that Marxism provide a scientific basis for revolutionary politics, it does not take us very much further forward from the book Marxism and Philosophy. This is perhaps why very few writers in Korsch have paid any attention to the book, The Materialist Conception of History. Those who have done so from rather an academic, non-political viewpoint. One exception is L. Kepa, who implies that Korsch makes a broader criticism of Kautsky than he actually does. He argues that, quote, for Korsch, the theoretical inability of Kautsky to grasp the problem of epistemological constitution on the basis of social praxis was related to the practical and political inability to historicize and thus revolutionize the bourgeois capitalist state, end quote. Thus, quote, According to Korsch, the positivistic aspects of Kautskyan evolutionary materialism find their counterpart in the idealist aspects, the reformist overemphasis of the bourgeois political state. End quote. El Kepa. This argument is not to be found in Korsch's book, nor is it a construction which can be placed on it without exercising great ingenuity. The book, The Materialist Conception of History, is important not so much in itself as for the tentative formulation it offers of ideas much more fully developed in the book The Anti-Critique. Considering the narrowly philosophical case first of all, I do not think that Korsch has proved that in the book Materialism and Imperial Criticism, Lenin defended a mechanical version of materialism. This chapter has shown that the question is more complicated than that. When necessary, Lenin could make formally correct statements about the dialectical character of Marxist materialism, which Korsch would have been bound to agree with. Although Lenin's book, Philosophical Notebooks, had not yet been published, he had made public pronouncements about philosophical questions which were strongly, quote, Hegelian, end quote, dialectical in character. In political terms, Korsch's, quote, ultra-radical argument that Leninism was merely an ideological form assumed by the bourgeois revolution in an undeveloped country misrepresents and underestimates the force of Lenin's critique of Western Marxists such as Kautsky. Lenin's controversy with Kautsky was determined by specific political considerations, the necessity of exposing to the vanguard of the working class the fact that Kautsky's, quote, left-wing opposition to the open reformists in the SPD was in essence quite fraudulent. By contrast, Korsch's analysis of Kautsky's general systematization of historical materialism was, in fact, if not in intention, rather academic in character. In the next chapter, we shall see that Korsch was to go beyond his rejection of Lenin's version of Marxism to a more systematic revision of his conception of Marxism itself. Okay, and that's the end of chapter 6 of Karl Korsch, A Study in Western Marxism.